The handcuffs were too tight. I noticed that detail with a strange, almost clinical precision. The steel biting into my left wrist, drawing a thin crescent of blood, while Detective Ray Harlow held his phone above his head and grinned like a man who had just won something. "Big fish, baby," he said to no one in particular, tilting the camera to get Sergeant Louis Vega into the frame. Neither of them was looking at me. I was the prop, the career maker, the story they'd tell at retirement dinners. What Harlow didn't know, what I watched him not know, standing in the diesel-soaked shadows of Pier 9's parking garage, was that 40 seconds earlier I had made a phone call, not to a lawyer, and within 48 hours Detective Ray Harlow would not have a career left to retire from. But to understand what happened in that garage, you need to understand who I was before I became Marcus Webb. And Marcus Webb had a very ordinary, very carefully constructed life. I had been a DEA special agent for 11 years. Field work, deep cover, the kind that doesn't show up on official rosters and doesn't get discussed at cookouts. For 2 years and 4 months before the night of my arrest, my name was Marcus Webb, logistics manager at Meridian Freight, a mid-sized shipping company operating out of the Baltimore waterfront. Marcus Webb drove a 2019 Lexus he didn't own. Marcus Webb ate breakfast every morning at Patsy's Diner on Eastern Avenue. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, sports page. And he was reliably boring in exactly the way a man running product for a cartel needs to be reliably boring. In reality, Meridian Freight was a DEA front, constructed over 4 years at significant cost, and my actual name was Special Agent Marcus Day, and I was 43 days away from shutting down the entire East Coast distribution arm of the Solis cartel. We're talking container numbers, stash houses in Newark and Camden, offshore accounts in Panama and Cyprus, the names of 3 accountants and a law firm in McLean, Virginia, that didn't know yet that we knew. 43 days. I had counted them on the calendar on my kitchen wall, the one with photos of Chesapeake Bay that Marcus Webb would plausibly own. My handler was Senior Agent Diane Forsyth, out of the DEA's Baltimore field office on West Fayette. Diane was 51 and had the particular steadiness of someone who had watched everything go wrong before and learned not to flinch. We talked twice a week on a burner line routed through 3 relays. She knew my cover, my contacts, my extraction protocol. She was, in every practical sense, the only person on earth who knew my real name on any given Tuesday. I trusted her the way you trust a load-bearing wall, not consciously, just foundationally, the way you trust the floor beneath your feet. 2 weeks before the arrest, Diane had called during a routine check-in and said, in a voice that was 2 degrees tighter than usual, "You're 43 days out. Don't create noise." I'd filed the tightness away and moved on. I should have pulled it out and examined it. I should have asked her what she meant by noise, and whether there was noise already, and where it was coming from. Instead, I hung up and went back to the manifest I was reviewing with Tomas. Tomas was the Solis Network's local coordinator, a quiet and careful man who had survived in this business by treating every room like it might already be watched. That Wednesday, 6 days before the arrest, he looked up from a shipping manifest and said, with the same inflection he used to discuss container weights, "Someone's been asking around about you." My hands stayed flat on the table. Asking what? Who you really are. He said it without emphasis, without accusation, the way you state a weather condition. I told them you're nobody. You're the manifest man. He tapped the papers once and didn't elaborate. I drove the Lexus back to my apartment and sat in the parking garage for 23 minutes. I didn't call Diane. I didn't call anyone. I sat with my hands in my lap and felt the weight of that word, really, settle somewhere behind my sternum. Not who you work for, who you really are. That was specific. That implied someone had a theory, not just a question. Someone who wasn't asking at random. There are 2 kinds of fear in this work. The first is loud and moves your body. The second is quiet and takes up residence in your chest and thinks alongside you, and that second kind is the one that will kill you if you let it. I drove to Dundalk the next morning, found the last working payphone in Baltimore County. I'd catalogued it 3 years ago for exactly this kind of moment, and called Diane on the burner. She picked up on the second ring and said, before I could speak, "I heard." The air went out of the morning. "How long?" I said. A pause. Not long, but long enough to mean she'd measured it. 2 days. We didn't want to spook you mid-operation. We're monitoring the source. It looks local, probably BPD. Someone fed information about an active federal operation to... I hung up. That was the first time in 11 years I had ended a call with my handler without a proper sign-off. I stood next to the payphone and watched a truck pull into the gas station and thought about the word local and the word BPD and the phrase fed information to, and the fact that someone inside the Baltimore Police Department knew enough about Operation Sandstone to be dangerous. That wasn't accidental contact. That was someone who was working for someone. And whoever that someone was, they were close enough to the Solus network to be worth worrying about. What I did not yet understand, what I wouldn't understand until I was already in the handcuffs, until Harlow was mid-selfie and my wrist was bleeding, was that I was standing at the edge of something far deeper than one dirty cop making a phone call. The betrayal had layers the way winter ice has layers, each one thinner, each one less visible, each one more likely to give way under your weight before you ever registered it was there. The arrest came on a Friday evening, 6 days after the payphone. I was walking from Meridian Freight's loading dock to the Lexus. End of day, nothing scheduled, the light going orange over the harbor, when 3 vehicles sealed the exit. 2 unmarked sedans, 1 patrol car. Coordinated. Harlow was out before his sedan stopped moving, badge up, moving with the energy of a man savoring something he'd rehearsed. "Marcus Webb," he said, then with a pause that was just a beat too theatrical. DEA, which was wrong. Harlow was BPD. He had no federal authority, no federal jurisdiction, no legal basis to invoke DEA charges. He was a city detective announcing federal counts in a parking lot without a federal agent in sight. Every syllable of that was wrong in a way that was too specific to be incompetent. Someone had written him a script. Someone who knew the right words. I put my hands up slowly. The cuffs went on. The blood started from my left wrist. And then Harlow had his phone out, and Vega was leaning in beside him, and the junior officer on the scene, 26 at most, with the look of a man standing slightly apart from something he hadn't fully agreed to, kept his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. I noticed that. I noticed that Harlow hadn't called the arrest in on his radio. Not once. I noticed that Vega's laugh was 3 notes too high. The laugh of a man who needs an audience to believe his own performance. I noticed the diesel smell, and the orange light, and the specific pitch of the echo in that parking structure, and I filed all of it away, because the part of my brain that records things without feeling them had understood, even before the rest of me had, that I was in a situation with no official protocol attached. They had not reported the arrest, which meant they had not intended to process me through official channels, which meant I had one window, and it was almost closed. I asked for my phone call. Harlow laughed. At the precinct, Big Fish. I asked again, evenly. I'd like to make that call before we go anywhere. Vega's hand tightened on my shoulder, and then I said the thing, the specific phrase I had been authorized to use under very specific operational circumstances, the phrase that existed for exactly this kind of situation. I said, I need you to dial a number before we leave. The person who answers will explain the situation. It is not a lawyer. Harlow looked at me with the particular contempt of a man certain he has already won, He looked at Vega. Vega shrugged. Harlow unlocked my right cuff, handed me his own phone with the look of a man granting a condemned prisoner his last meal, and waited. I dialed. The line rang twice. Then the voice on the other end, clear, official, carrying the particular weight of institutional authority, said, "Deputy Administrator's Office, Drug Enforcement Administration. Identify yourself." Harlow's grin didn't disappear all at once. It dissolved, feature by feature, like something melting from the inside, until what was left on his face was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but something between the two that looked, from where I stood, like the first moment a man understands that the ground he's been standing on was never solid. The phone slipped slightly in his hand. I caught it before it fell. "I'll take it from here," I said, and for the first time since the cuffs went on, I looked him directly in the eye. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in a parking garage. Harlow held the phone the way a man holds something that has just burned him, loosely, at a slight distance, as if the damage was already done, and the instinct was simply to not make it worse. Vega had stopped smiling entirely. The junior officer by the sedan had turned to face us fully now, and whatever he saw in my face kept him very still. I reached out and took the phone from Harlow's hand. He let me. "I'm going to need you to remove the handcuffs," I said. "And then I'm going to need you to not leave this garage." My voice was level in the particular way that professional training makes a voice level. Not calm, exactly, but controlled, the way a river is controlled by its banks. Harlow looked at Vega. Vega looked at the floor. The cuffs came off. I pressed the phone back to my ear. "Deputy Administrator Marsh," I said. "I need an extraction team at Pier 9, Meridian Freight Lot. I need internal affairs on standby. And I need someone to pull Agent Forsyth's communications logs going back 90 days. A pause on the line. Then, "We're already pulling them." Something in those 4 words turned the floor slightly unsteady beneath me. Not physically, but in the way understanding shifts the ground of everything else. Already. They were already pulling her logs, which meant they had already been looking, which meant Diane was not a suspicion. Diane was a case. I stood in that parking garage with Harlow's blood draining from his face and thought about every conversation, every check-in, every burner call, and tried to remember if I'd told Diane anything in the last 90 days that I hadn't told anyone else. I had. I had told her the container numbers. The real ones, not the operational cover versions. The actual containers with the actual dates carrying the actual product. I had told her because she was my handler, and that was what handlers received. I had trusted her the way you trust a load-bearing wall. And somewhere in the last 90 days that wall had been quietly selling the architecture to the other side. I want to tell you I saw it coming. I want to tell you there were signs I'd catalogued and filed and simply hadn't interpreted correctly. But standing in the Pier 9 lot with the orange light finally gone and the harbor going dark, I had to admit what was true. I had not seen it. Not once. Diane had been careful, consistent, and kind in the particular professional way that makes kindness feel like bedrock. She had been my reality check and my extraction plan and my Tuesday morning voice for 11 years. And she had been on the Solace payroll for at least 3 of them. The DEA's internal review would later confirm it was 22 months. 22 months of her knowing every move I made before I made it. 22 months of containers rerouted, informants burned, evidence quietly degassed before it could land. But the betrayal had a 3rd layer, and I found it the next morning in a conference room on the 4th floor of the DEA's Baltimore field office, drinking the worst coffee I had ever tasted from a styrofoam cup, while a man named Special Agent Torres from Internal Affairs laid a folder on the table and said, without preamble, "Thomas has been cooperating with BPD since March." I set the cup down. Cooperating how? Torres opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. Harlow and Tomas at a bar I recognized on South Broadway, sitting close enough to be conspirators. The timestamp read 8 months ago. Tomas was Harlow's source, Torres said. He wasn't just a Solis coordinator. He was Harlow's man inside your operation, planted 18 months before you were placed. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The careful man with quiet hands and steady eyes, who had treated every room like it might be watched, because it had been, by him. He told you someone was asking around about you, Torres said, almost gently. That was misdirection. He was the one who'd been asking. The metal taste of the coffee turned into something else entirely at the back of my throat. Every interaction I'd had with Tomas, every manifest, every quiet warning, every piece of information I'd treated as intelligence, had been stage management. I had been performing for him for 2 years, and he had been performing for Harlow, who had been performing for the Solis cartel, who had been paying Diane. The layers went down further than I had understood from the parking garage, and each one had cost me something I hadn't known was at risk. The first confrontation happened in that same conference room, 2 hours later, when they brought Diane in. She walked through the door in a gray blazer, and for a moment she looked exactly like the Diane I had known. Composed, unhurried, the kind of woman who had seen everything and metabolized it. Then she saw me, and something moved across her face. Not guilt, calculation. She was figuring out what I knew and how quickly. "Marcus," she said. "Sit down, Diane," Torres said. She sat. There was a silence, the kind that has weight and corners, before she said, "Whatever you think happened." "I don't think anything," I said. My voice was very quiet. "I know you gave them the container numbers. I know you burned 3 informants in 14 months. I know Harlow was your contact and Tomas was your eyes inside my cover. I know about the account in Cyprus. The last part was a controlled gamble. I'd seen the Cyprus account referenced in an intercepted Solis communication, but didn't yet have Diane's name attached. The micro change in her posture told me everything. Her left hand, resting on the table, moved 1 millimeter closer to her body. She had heard Cyprus and believed I had the document. "I want a lawyer," she said. "That's the smartest thing you've said today," I replied, and stood up. The next 72 hours were the ones I think about most, in the way you think about things that happened while you were operating on pure mechanism, all your feelings locked in a room somewhere waiting for later. I went back to the Fells Point apartment, under escort, technically, though I'd waived it, and I sat at the kitchen table with the calendar on the wall and the sports page on the counter and the cold smell of a life I'd inhabited for 2 years, like a borrowed coat. 43 days. On the calendar. I pulled the pen from the drawer and crossed each remaining day out slowly, one by one, until the page was full of small X marks that looked like something a prisoner would make. Then I tore the page off the calendar and folded it twice and put it in my jacket pocket. Not as a memento, as a reminder of what systematic patience looks like when it's pointed in the right direction. I didn't sleep that night. I made coffee at 2 in the morning and stood at the window watching the harbor lights, and I thought about Diane's voice on the burner, all those Tuesday mornings, and I let myself feel it once. The particular grief of trusting something that wasn't trustworthy. The specific cold of realizing the wall you'd leaned against was hollow. I gave myself that hour. Just the one. Then I went back to the table, opened my laptop and began building the case myself, with everything I had inside my own memory, documented and organized in a form that didn't require Diane's confirmation or Tomas's testimony to stand up. I worked until 6. At 6:15, with the harbor going gray with early light, I called a man named Arthur Reese, the DEA's chief forensic accountant, who I'd worked with once 4 years ago on a money laundering case in Atlanta. I said, "Arthur, I know where the Cyprus account feeds. I need 12 hours and a grand jury subpoena. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I'll have the subpoena by noon. That was the moment the case stopped being something that was happening to me and became something I was doing. The difference mattered. It mattered in my hands, which had stopped shaking sometime in the night. It mattered in my voice, which came out level not because of training but because I had made a decision, somewhere between 2 in the morning and 6:15, about who I was going to be on the other side of this. The final confrontation was public, which was the only way it could be, given what was at stake. We held it, and I use the word held with the specific intent of someone who engineered every minute of it. At a federal court hearing 3 weeks later, the kind of preliminary proceeding that normally draws 2 reporters and falls apart in 20 minutes. Except that we had subpoenaed Harlow, Vega, Tomas, and 5 Solis Network associates, and seated them in the same room with a federal judge, a deputy DA, 3 journalists who had been given 45-minute advance notice, and Arthur Reese, who walked in carrying a banker's box and set it on the table with the particular quiet of a man who knows exactly what is inside it. Harlow, seeing me at the table across the aisle, looked at the banker's box and then at me, and said, voice lowered like that would help, "You don't have anything solid. You're working from memory, and—" The Cyprus account received $2,400,000 over 22 months, I said, at normal volume. The subpoena covers all of it. The transfers, the corresponding DEA files that went dark, the informants who died. You're on the wire for 3 of them. The journalist had their recorders out. Harlow's attorney put her hand on his arm. He shook it off. "You're a nobody," he said. The contempt was real, but it was the contempt of a frightened man, which sounds different from the original kind. Thinner, with a tremor underneath. I looked at him the way you look at something you've already finished thinking about. "I was nobody," I said. "Now I'm the witness." Vega broke first. He'd been a follower all his life, and he was a follower at the end. He took the cooperation deal before the hearing finished, and his testimony added the 4th and 5th layers of the operation that Arthur's accounting had already confirmed. Thomas lasted another week before his own lawyer told him the math didn't work. Diane went to trial and lost in 11 days. The Solis Network's East Coast arm, disrupted by the arrests and the exposure of their police protection, collapsed in 6 weeks. Not the 43 days I'd planned. 6 weeks. Different math, same result. Harlow was sentenced to 14 years. He appealed twice and lost twice. The apartment he'd owned in Canton, bought, as it turned out, with money routed through a Solis shell company, was seized by federal asset forfeiture and later auctioned. He had been the kind of man who thought his address meant something. The address was gone. I was reassigned, debriefed, evaluated, and given 2 months of administrative leave that I spent in my real apartment. A place in D.C. that smelled like old books and had a window that faced east. I slept real hours. I ate food that I actually wanted, not food that Marcus Webb would plausibly eat. I called my sister 3 times in the first week, which was 3 times more than I'd managed in the previous year. "You sound different," she said, the 3rd time. "I am different," I told her. She didn't ask how. She just said, "Good." 6 months later, I walked past Patsy's diner on a trip back to Baltimore for a court follow-up. I didn't go in. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the window where Marcus Webb used to sit with his scrambled eggs and his sports page, and I thought about the calendar on the wall and the 43 X marks, and I felt something that took me a moment to identify, because I hadn't felt it in a long time. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more precise than that. It was the feeling of a man who knows with certainty that the life he is currently standing in is actually his own. I turned away from the window and kept walking. The morning was cold, and the harbor was silver, and somewhere in the distance a ship's horn sounded once, clean and low, The way something sounds when it is finally moving in the right direction.